Good to have you here, Justin.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess I'm going to jump into some questions. How old were you when you knew you wanted to write?
I've been doing it since I was a kid, so I think the first story I remember writing was a school assignment for, I don't remember how, I think it was around second grade. It was for Polar Express, like writing like a sequel or a follow-on or a side story or something like that. And I think I won, a little award for my grade or something like that. So that's the first time I really remember writing a story, like
Wow.
end to finish to end, or start to end. And then in fifth grade, I had the opportunity to kind of pick a class, and it was just I did writing, and it was hosted by I think it was maybe fifth grade, yeah. It was hosted by Clear Lake, Houston Clear Lake, and so I got to go do that. They had some choices. That was what I chose. So I have a little book about an alien invasion, so it was sci-fi, early on, right?
And that, I wanted to ask that after reading your bio online. What was first, writing or sci-fi, or did they happen at the same time, or space in general?
I think so. I consider myself lucky. My brother and I were on opposite ends of the spectrum. I'm a younger brother, and he didn't know what he wanted to do until he was got his master's. He literally. Whereas when I was in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, I knew I wanted to work at NASA, and I already knew I wanted to write books. So it's been a long time. I was fortunate enough. I went to Webster Intermediate in the WAVE program. They had kind of an open elective in the morning, and one program they had was called KidSat, and KidSat lets you interact with the onboard crew of the shuttle, or eventually now it's a space station, still actually runs the program, believe it or not. They call it EarthCam, Sally Ride EarthCam now. But basically you would request pictures of the Earth based on the track they were going through, and there was a whole process for going through that, and then the crew would take the pictures and send them back as like, hey, that's the picture I got. And so I did that class several times, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and that was like my first introduction to NASA and doing all that. And so ever since then I was like, I want to work at NASA. Didn't know what it meant. Eventually I learned that's okay, engineer is probably the way to go. That's where I ended up.
So engineer, did you have like a mechanical inclination early on in math and science?
I've been blessed enough to be pretty good at all subjects. In high school I was actually probably better at social studies and English, but I wanted to work at NASA. So it was like, we work on the math, work on the science, and I was pretty good at that stuff. I wasn't great at like biology or chemistry, but the physics I was pretty good at, the calculus I was pretty good at.
That interests me because it's seemingly two different skill sets, creative writing and language arts, and the hard sciences, which, to work doing something like you're doing at NASA, you need a lot of hard science prep.
Right.
So both hemispheres of your brain are firing, as they say.
I like to use them all, keeps me active. And,
full panorama of life. So when did you first get the idea for Embargo on Hope?
So I actually started this book a long time ago. I was 18, 19 in college. I had a summer where I had moved into an apartment. I was in an apartment kind of by myself. It was a summer, so in a college town, in College Station, not really a whole lot of people around. So I had a lot of time to myself, just my dog and I. And so I just started writing. And where it started off from was I was just fascinated by the idea of how the embargo around South Africa was put in place to end apartheid, and that was kind of a global thing where many countries agreed, hey, this needs to end, it's wrong, and they came together and put, back then it was more physical ships actually blocking trade into South Africa, and eventually they crumbled to the pressure and ended apartheid. I mean, not saying that solved all the problems, but at least from a legal, social perspective, it was ended. And so I took that and said, hey, what if we did that to a whole planet? And then it just kind of grew from there. I'm not a planner, I don't outline, I don't do that kind of stuff.
Okay, I can cross some of these questions.
So the funny thing is I started with that idea, and I've always been fascinated by revolutions in general, just French revolutions and all the others, just especially the French ones, because it just seemed so violent and sudden.
And the birth of the modern world and modern politics.
Right, or even when we had the Arab Spring a few years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Like that was just interesting, especially because Twitter was a factor then. But but all that just fascinates me. It started from there, and then as I started writing, it just grew into something different. And I'll never forget I had that feeling when I was like, oh, this is what the book's actually about. This is what the series is about. And it just kind of contained discussion on religion and belief and faith and all of that, and it kind of came out of nowhere. So because I didn't have a plan for it. So
So well, since you told the initial idea for your book, and I'll skip to this question: why do you think science fiction is a good genre for expressing social commentary or exploring contemporary issues?
I think that's a more difficult question, but one thing I think it gives you a lot of freedom. right? You're not constrained in the world and with people, or if you're writing about real people, then even if it's a kind of a different history or something like that, you're still you're a little bit constrained, and also, I mean, it's really easy to offend people, right? And it's really hard to capture the nuance, right? Because so just to use a very recent example, so the Queen died this week, right? Just I think I can't remember, it was yesterday. I think it was yesterday, right? And there's been a whole lot of opinions on the internet. Some of them have been tragic. This is a tragedy. Some of them have been kind of hilarious. It's just different spectrums, and I haven't taken any side. It's interesting how one person, and there's a lot of nuance there.
Yes.
It's not so simple as, well, she was alive when this happened. It's like, well, she inherited this situation. She did cause this situation. And it's a lot. There's just a whole lot. When you've been alive for 96 years and ruling for 70 of them.
A lot of things happen.
Yeah, and so it's just how much can you directly attribute to her and how much can't, and how much can you say, well, that's the time she grew up in, and all of that. So getting back to the question, the reason I like science fiction is because you can create that nuance yourself, and you're not going to step over any boundaries that exist, right? I mean, people can look at it and say, hey, this sounds like this person, right? Or this sounds like this event. And I might be able to say, yep, that directly correlates, or I might say, well, I didn't even think about that, but you're right. But it gives you a lot of freedom to create those things. That being said, you got to ground it in realism. So you can't just go do whatever you want because it doesn't come off as realistic, and you'll lose the reader.
That's a question I had while I was reading your book, is how do you balance familiarity and invention when you're creating a science fiction world? Because you have things like mole-born nuts. I'm like, I don't know what mole-born means, but it paints the picture, because I know it's a nut and it sounds exotic or otherworldly, rather,
right. Yeah, it's a tricky balance because, and I can't remember, there's some rule, and I say rule with quotes, about, if you have too many made-up terms, then you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're saying, right? Yeah. And I don't ascribe to that, and I kind of think it's silly, but it's like, on one hand, you want it to be its own world. It's not Earth. Earth is not in the cosmos as far as this book goes, and so using those Earth terms doesn't make sense. And you got to be careful about things like, sometimes I look up, where did this word come from? Because you realize later, oh, this has a very specific meaning that you wouldn't have thought about, because it's just everyday parlance, right? It's just things you say. You don't realize, oh, this happened because of this specific event, or this, this person that lived is where this phrase came from. So it's those kind of things you'd be tricky. On the other hand, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about trees or something. People know what trees are, And so it is a balance that you have to strike throughout between, do I want to create something new that I got to keep up with, or do I just want to keep on going with something the reader already understands and knows? Yeah. And it's every time it's a scene, it's okay, do I go with this or this? And it's just, you keep going. And you make the best choice you think you can.
So, getting back, you said you started when you were 18 or 19, and this is of particular interest to me, and I'm sure a lot of creative folk and other artists. A lot of people have a project that they've been working on. It's either they don't have the time to or the confidence or inspiration at the moment to get it out, and it just lingers. How do you stay motivated through the endeavor? How do you not lose faith? After 7 years have passed, you're like, is my story even good? That kind of doubt.
Absolutely. And so, it's funny just because I just keep coming back to it. I abandoned it for a while and be like, it was always in the back of my head, hey, I want to work on that book. And I come back to it, and I even tried submitting it to publishers and agents a little bit, and it didn't work. It just never came out, and then you start having that doubt, and then you get discouraged and you don't touch it for a while. I think the biggest thing that happened, obviously the pandemic is a big thing, and so it gave me some time, right? It wasn't just literally the drive to work being gone, right, and back. And my commute's not even that far, but there's a whole, you gotta get dressed, you gotta, all of that is just, it's a funny thing to think about it, but you got an hour of your life back just by working from home. Yeah. And some people much more because they commute now. 2 hours. Especially around here, right? Yeah. So, so just having that, I think just having that extra time. Plus, you're not seeing people, you're not hanging out with friends, you're not, even family, right? A lot of people were limiting contact with family, including us. So, just having, just making that commitment, trying to find things to do, and it was kind of like, I took classes online, I started just doing a bunch of reading on how to get better, and it was just, okay, I'm going to set aside time to do this every day. And I think that applies to any project. If you set aside the time to do it, and you force yourself, then eventually it's going to get done, right? With books, it's a little bit different because you can just keep on going. And eventually, you got to say, you know what, this is good enough. This is as good as it's going to get. Or, I could keep polishing it, but it's not going to make that much difference if I change this word from this to this, right? And so it's just a matter of setting aside that time and making it happen.
So can you give us a little synopsis of Embargo on Hope?
Yeah. So Embargo on Hope, it follows basically a 16-year-old who lives in the slums of this planet Vastir. And his father was a great hero, and suddenly it just kind of changed on a dime, where all of a sudden his father fell into madness, is kind of what they called it. Everyone else called it, and so he kind of used the same language because he was hearing the same thing, and he started this revolution against the royalty of the world. And it was strange because he had worked for them for a long time, he was friends with many of them, and it didn't make any sense, and especially to Duran, who was 11 at the time.
Yeah.
It really made no sense to him, and he never really got an explanation for it. And so because of the way that the social structure is set up in this world, when you do something like that, you pay for your father's sins or your mother's sins. You pay for your ancestors' sins. So he ended up going all the way to the slums because it was such a terrible thing for his father to have done. The book kicks off. The embargo has been happening for a few years now, and it's one of those ironic things that you see in life where the embargo was set to try to help these people, but yet they're suffering the most because everyone else is kind of hoarding their resources, and there's just not enough left for the people at the bottom. And so he's scraping by with his best friend, and then the book turns when someone comes to see him from another planet about, hey, I know what happened to your father. Mm-hmm. And so then everything kind of kicks off from there. Kayla's arrival is kind of the inciting incident. And so Kayla, Durin, and then his friend's sister, Fira, go off on this journey to find out. They don't know what's there or what's going to happen, but they know something happened at that point in his father's life to change everything. And so then they go through a journey through slums and forests and plains and to figure that out. And they arrive at this temple, which you can kind of think of in terms like a Mayan temple. I took a lot of inspiration from Mayan temples for that, and then it all kind of kicks off from there.
Fascinating. So yeah, when I first chapter or two, you're already sort of doing some cross-genre stuff. I noticed. It's like, okay, kind of this dystopic or otherworldly post-apocalyptic feel, but then all of a sudden there's necromancers robbing the cargo thing that they're trying to rob. Like, okay, so I can tell you're inspired by not just sci-fi, but you read a lot of fantasy too. I'm sure. Yeah,
love fantasy. I try to read both. So what's funny is as I've gone back and kind of done, I won't say it's a literature study, but a lot of times H just asks for comps, right? And I go out and look, and I'm like, there's not a whole lot out there. It's a pretty small genre of things that mix sci-fi and fantasy. There's kind of been this wall between them for years. They're both speculative fiction. Yeah. But there's been a wall between them, and it's starting to crumble, I think, more in recent years. But I was even trying to find 5 books that I really like that mix sci-fi and fantasy, and they don't really exist. And
do 1 or 2 exist?
There's some, so obviously, Star Wars is the most popular example, right? The Force is the magic, and obviously they're in space and flying from planet to planet. And my book, I think, takes a lot of inspiration from there. But, I recently read a book called Nine Fox Gambit that came out a few years ago. It was a Hugo nominee. That one has kind of some, it's almost, the technology is so advanced, there's kind of it's kind of fantasy-like, Mixia by Scott Reinken is another one. That's a trilogy that has kind of this mixture of, that one they kind of find this foreign resource, I guess I'll call it, on another planet, and they kind of abuse these people with abilities.
But there's not tens of thousands like there are science fiction, right. Where they're hard science fiction like Larry Niven or... No, you're not going to find many. Or maybe there'll be like one reference where it's like, this is kind of fantastical, but it's not really, it's still grounded somehow in science or technology. Like Hyperion's an example where it's, a lot of the ideas are really far out there, but it's supposed to be technologically or evolutionarily possible, or, they have portals between worlds and stuff, but it's also supposed to be kind of grounded in science. So you mentioned you're not a planner when you write, so I'm guessing you don't do tons of character sketches, maps, drawings to kind of build your world.
I do have maps. I should have brought some with me, but I do write out maps. But it's almost, a lot of it's kind of after the fact, right? So a lot of times I'll get to my first draft, and then when I'm going through to edit, I'm like, okay, I need to add a little more rigor around this, and so then I'll go back and do maps or character sketches to make sure that, hey, this character is consistent throughout, or has an arc that I like, or, so actually it ends up being a lot after the fact when I've kind of figured out the basic story. The reason I don't like to outline, and I outlined a book once, I wanted to write about Atlantis because I find Atlantis fascinating. I outlined the whole book, and I didn't want to write the book.
Yeah.
It was just how it happened. So I like kind of letting the story flow and seeing where it takes me.
This is where the characters take you.
Right, and like I said, this ended up someplace completely different. I like doing that and then coming back and fixing it after. Now, if you want to be someone who's very prolific, that's hard to do because you end up with more drafts.
Yeah.
Even right now, I'm in the middle of the third book, and I wrote the first draft in about a month last year. And I took off a weekend where pretty much all I did was write. And I got like half the book written that weekend. But what I'm finding is now I'm going through the second draft and I'm having to rewrite a lot. And I'm like, well, this character is not consistent. This character doesn't, or this character is not. There's not enough to differentiate this character, or do I even need this character? And I'm going back and having to rewrite a lot for the second draft to give it more interest, to make it more rigid, to flesh out the things from the first and second book that I've set up. I'm like, hey, I didn't even address this, and yet it's set up. So it's a lot of those things where it's like, well, it's great that I wrote it all the way through, but now I have to go back and fix it.
Interesting. So your writing process, do you just sit down and see what comes out? I mean, do you work on any like basic I know you don't outline, but I guess you're going about your day and you have it in your head, oh, I want to illustrate this or write out this scene today or this sequence, or...
I just, I kind of, when I'm first writing, it's just kind of, I know kind of how I want to get from point A to point B. I don't know how I'm going to get there.
I see.
And sometimes I'll do things like, I'll look up, what are some really interesting places on Earth, right? Like, you see those places, for example, I just wrote something where a village is built over a lake and streams that have bioluminescent algae, right?
Ooh.
Because I just saw a cool picture of a lake with I'm like, I want to do that,
Bioluminescent algae.
Yeah, algae, or maybe it was bacteria, but, something like that, and it's just, so it just glows blue or red at night or whatever, and I'm like, I want to build a village on top of that, right? And so it seems like I've shoehorned it in, but it's like, well, I had a village, it didn't have any interest to it. Yeah. And so now I've added in, made it more interesting, And so I'll do things like that, I'll be like, this is a cool location, how can I do something similar? But generally it's just kind of, especially as you get further in the series, it's like, I know I have to get from here to here. Mm-hmm. Not exactly sure how I'm going to get there yet. Let's kind of see where it goes,
Okay. That sounds like it's taking you on an adventure.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I like writing this way, because it's almost like reading something that I would like,
Oh, okay. So, where did Lisa cut did time? Oh, there we go. How did you promote your book when it was first released?
So promotion is so hard, right? So for a lot of people, a lot of authors, right? They're like, I'm good at writing, and to a lot of people, it's an introverted activity, right? Like it's something that you sit at your desk and you mostly do by yourself. Now, of course, there's author groups and there's those kind of things you can get involved in. There's the dog, I've got my wife and kids who are helping or hindering, especially in the kids' case, But in general, though, it's an activity you do by yourself, or maybe some people go to a cafe. I've done that sometimes, where you sit at a cafe and just put headphones in or whatever. But it's a very introverted activity, and now you gotta go do marketing. It's like, this is a very extroverted, like you're trying to sell what you're doing, right? You're trying to say, hey, this is something you might like, give this a shot, but you're kind of really putting your heart out there, right? Because it's something you built and designed yourself. When I do presentations at NASA, it's a lot easier because I'm presenting information it just is, like it's mostly just facts, I might put my opinion on top of it, but it's generally not something I've completely created myself. Whereas this, I'm like, hey, this is something that came completely out of my head. I hope you like it, And so it's the marketing part is just so hard. I've tried doing a little bit of advertising here and there, and it's really hard to get a good return on investment there. And so it's what you end up finding is that you need other skills to go do the marketing piece and actually sell some books. You've got friends and family that hopefully have been supportive and they'll buy it. But then you're trying to get out of that a little bit and trying to get complete strangers who are on the internet or on Twitter or whatever to buy your book. And so I do a fair amount of social media. I use Instagram a lot. Part of it is just knowing your audience, right? So I'm trying to reach the young adult audience. Well, they're on Instagram, and unfortunately they're on TikTok. And so I haven't delved into the TikTok yet, but a lot of people say that TikTok is the most effective selling tool for books. And there's something about how things go viral on TikTok that it has the highest return on investment. So unfortunately, I'll probably be starting a TikTok here soon, especially with young people. Sure. Right? So even Instagram was a little bit outside my comfort zone because, again, it's putting yourself out there as pictures, right? Facebook or Twitter, it's just words. I can write all day long, right? That's what I do. But then you're starting to do pictures and you're trying to come up with visuals and you're trying to come up with content and it becomes a lot more complicated.
So speaking of visuals, did you design the cover of your books, or
So
did you?
this one was designed by there's two different processes here. This one I went to a publisher called Atmosphere Press in Austin. It's a small indie publisher. They have a cover designer in house, and he gave me 3 different options for what he thought. I gave him some ideas of kind of what I wanted the cover, just words. There's a couple of things that when you look at genre, when you look at a book, you want to know what genre it's in, right? Readers want to be able to look at a book instantly and say, okay, this is something that I might like or I might not like. And so if it doesn't look like a science fiction book, you're not going to get your science fiction audience. And so there's things like there should be a spaceship on the cover. For young adult books, if you go look, a lot of them have characters on the cover. I'm honestly not a big fan of characters on the cover. A lot of them have large characters on it. So I was like, let's do silhouettes. It's kind of a middle ground there.
Okay.
And so he gave me 3 options, and I kind of mashed them all together, right? Like this text was on one option, this background was on another option. It was kind of, can we start putting these together, do some tweaks? And he just did a great job. It was a very easy process, actually. He just did a great job, and it took maybe 3 cuts, I think, to actually get to this. And I love it. I think it's so great. This one, so because I independently published that one, I didn't go back to the publisher just to save on some funds. I hired someone separately for that, and I said, hey, let's take this look and feel, but I want to go with more explosive colors because of the content of that book. So that's why you have the red and the kind of blue. We go to different worlds in this book, so that one there's a frozen world and then there's a volcanic world, and so I tried to incorporate that on the cover. But a lot of it for me was just, hey, I just want some bright colors, and so the artist on that one, she had that background like the first shot. I was like, this is awesome. And then she took the rest of the elements, and I think we ended up with I think it's another great cover, honestly. And again, you can see the spaceship up there because, again, you want the spaceship. If you look at sci-fi books, almost all of them have a spaceship on it. So start looking for it because they'll notice it.
Okay. Start going through the collection. So, how has your day job helped inspire or inform your writing? Any particular tasks from your career that have transferred to your author life?
I don't know if there's been anything in particular. You hear a lot of generic science, especially because when I worked on payloads, it's like cutting edge new stuff. And so you hear a lot of those things, and I don't think I directly incorporate anything into the book, but there are things that I just maybe took bits and pieces and incorporated. One thing that really bothers me about a lot of science fiction is, and I think one of the more recent Star Trek movies did this, where ships somehow go straight from space down to Earth. It just drives me crazy because you can't do that. That breaks the laws of physics, right? You have to go into orbit first and then deorbit. And so I try to incorporate some of those realistic things. But I have some future ideas that I think are going to incorporate more of my direct NASA experience, especially living and working in space, because now I've worked on 2 space stations, 3 space stations actually. So I'm learning a lot about actual living and working in space and how that works and how that affects people and how that changes how regimented things are and those kind of things. And so for future ideas, I definitely want to incorporate some of that real life experience. It doesn't apply quite as much here, but it does to some extent too.
So, are you planning to just hone in and develop the star-marked world, or are you going to create other speculative worlds?
I haven't entirely decided yet. So, I'm going to finish this trilogy. I have a 3-part series here. I have thought about what I would do for prequels and sequels to the series, but the thing that's tricky about really long series, and a lot of people do it really well, but really long series is you have to have a character arc for each book and overarching, right? And so trying to figure out, so for Durin, my main character, it's like you have to have a satisfying character arc in each single book and then across, right? But the longer that gets, the harder that gets, right? And so it's almost, I said I took inspiration from Star Wars. I probably would go with a Star Wars model for this, where these 3 books are about Durin and Fira and Kayla, and then the books before it, I probably would focus on his father, where he becomes the main character. The books after actually have an entirely different main character that still ties into that same universe. So I have ideas for all of that. I have actually started writing a prequel, and I have started writing a sequel, but I think what I'm going to do, I've got another book that I'm querying right now, completely unrelated. It's middle grade sci-fi too. One thing I'll say that's great about this book is it's so much shorter. It's super easy to edit, right? So it's somewhere in the 40 to 50,000 words as opposed to over 100,000. I'm already done editing. I've already gone through the whole book again. It's just the longer it gets, the longer it takes. And the harder it gets. So I'm trying to do that one to an agent. If I do get an agent, hopefully, then that might influence what I do next. I think next I want to write, I was talking about something to be more influenced by work. I have another idea I think I'm going to have to do a little more plotting, unfortunately, just because it's more complicated. These books all take place from a single point of view, in first person. I think this next book I'm talking about would be 3 points of view, and then you got to weave it all together. So if you think about, not quite Game of Thrones type complexity, but once you start having multiple points of view, their stories have to intersect and all that, and it requires a little more planning. So I'm thinking I'm going to try to do that book next, but we'll see.
So, can you tell us a little about the Gateway program and what you're involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. The Gateway is going to be our outpost around the moon. So if you think about the ISS is a huge station that's been in orbit for over 20 years. It took more than 10 years to build it between shuttle launches and Russian launches. And it's gigantic, It holds 8 crew almost all the time now. The Gateway is a little bit different. We're going to put that in orbit around the moon. It's going to be at ISS is in a roughly circular orbit. This orbit's going to be much more elliptical, where it gets very close to the moon on one side and then it's very far away from it on the other side. The reason for that is it's a fairly stable orbit. It gives you different kind of atmospheres, environments, right? You've got more of a deep space environment where you're farther away from the body, and then there's a close environment where if you want to go down to the moon, it's an easier transit, right? So it's a very clever orbit that they've selected. It's called NRHO, Near Rectilinear Halo Orbit. And so it's a very interesting orbit for that. So the Gateway is going to be kind of our stopping point on the way to the moon. So Orion, which is trying to launch right now on the Space Launch System, the rocket, is trying to launch on Artemis 1 uncrewed test mission. The Orion would carry the crew up to the Gateway. They would dock to the Gateway, which I'll show a little bit here. And then they would take the human lander system down to the moon, back up to Gateway, reorganize things a little bit, and come back to Earth on Orion. If you think about the Apollo missions, it's kind of like how we would have a crew member stay in orbit while 2 went down to the moon and came back up. So Gateway is kind of that staying up in orbit. The current plan is to have 2 crew members stay in orbit while 2 crew members go down. About 30-day total missions, where I want to say it's somewhere between around 2 weeks where they're down on the moon, they come back, and then the rest of the time they're on the Gateway. Okay. And then they abandon the Gateway for the rest of the year. Pretty much we do about 1 launch a year. They don't go back, and so the Gateway is uncrewed for a long time, and then a crew comes back in, turns the lights on, does it again. So that's a whole bunch of new challenges, because ISS has crew all the time. Something goes wrong, hey, crew member, go look at it. In this case, you've had 11 months where there's no crew up there, so there has to be a lot more automation. Obviously, a lot of advances that we've had since we started building ISS help with that, just to manage something that doesn't have anyone there. And so they're still working on parameters about how they would do that. Do we depressurize? Do we let the oxygen levels drop? All those kind of things are still things they're trading, but it's a very interesting set of problems because there's no people there.
More automation. I wonder if eventually drones will go and fix things.
Could be. Could be. If you look on the ISS videos, you can find things where they're working on. They have a lot of satellites. They're called. They used to be called spheres. Now they're called bumblebees. Astrobees. Now they're called astrobees, but they're satellites that go inside, and their whole goal is to not only test like satellite dynamics without having to be in the harsh space environment, but it also allows you to just test things like automation, like sound detection, or like if you have noisy sounding, go check it out, or something like that. So they're working on all those kind of things now. So I was going to show this video. It's a build-up video that I think we put out last year. It's not 100% accurate already. Things change all the time as we're working on design. But basically it shows you how we were going to put together the Gateway in orbit, again about a launch a year. And one thing I do want to point out is it's a lot smaller than ISS. It's probably about a quarter the size of ISS, so as you've probably seen the pictures before where ISS is laid out on a football field, and that's how big the solar arrays are. We're talking about something maybe a quarter of that size for Gateway. Okay, all right. So I'm going to talk through the modules. I might pause. Well, I don't think this video is particularly fast, but so essentially we've got our first 2 elements here. What this is called is the power and propulsion element, and Halo, which is habitation and logistics outpost. So Halo is this module here, and this module here is PPE, the power and propulsion module. So Halo is where the crew will initially live and work. Whereas this module doesn't actually have any volume inside, which is also interesting because all the ISS modules have at least a little bit of volume inside. But this is essentially your solar arrays, your batteries, your thermal dissipation. It's doing all of the system's work, whereas this is doing all the work for the initial habitation. So these are the first 2 elements. And then comes in from the side, what we've got here now is This is the International Habitation Module. So this is actually being built by ESA, the European Space Agency. And this is Orion here on the end. So the first mission that Orion takes to the Gateway, which is currently Artemis 4, brings up the International Habitation Module. And what that allows is now we have more room for crew. This one is pretty packed if you're trying to pack all the crew in there. Not to say it can't be done. It can be done.
How many people can fit in
Well, in this one, we're going to go ahead and be able to have 4.
4?
So it's built to support 4. So this is essentially just more volume to do both for the crew to live and work, right? And obviously they can work in here too, right? This is Orion. If anything were to go wrong, they can hop in Orion and leave, right? That's what it's designed for. But you can live and work in here. It has all the things you need to protect the crew. It'll have, food, exercise, bathroom, all of that kind of stuff. Between these 3, we've got that whole build-up to support a crew of 3 or 4 people. So we're planning on being a little bit different, where we'd have the human lander system come, and they would go ahead and go down to the moon, Artemis 4. When this was built, we weren't planning on that. So this is a logistics module. We actually would probably have one of these earlier. Basically, a logistics module is just bringing cargo up to both outfit, finish outfitting, because we've got some tight mass margins, right? When you're flying these 2 modules together, and there's a lot of batteries and those kind of things, very heavy, and so we're working at tight mass margins. The more we can put in here, the more it lets us save some space in those vehicles. And also, supplies for the crew, food to last 30 days, those kind of things. But what you'll notice too is it also brought an arm along with it. So for the initial missions, there won't be an arm, but then the logistics mission will bring an arm along with it, also being built by Canada again, just like the ISS arm. A little bit smaller than the ISS one, but also a little bit more advanced. And this arm allows us to do outside maintenance and inspections and outside payloads, those kind of things. Anything that's outside before kind of has to launch in place because there's no way to get it out there. So you can see the arm translating, doing its kind of spider walk across. And here's our human lander system. So this is something that we're using the reference design here, but the first one has already been selected to be SpaceX's Starship, so it's actually quite a bit bigger than that. But that's what will actually take the crew down to the moon. Whenever the crew arrives, we should have Orion coming up here again soon. So here is, well, that's Orion and the airlock. So I'll talk about Orion, or the Orion. But so Orion shows up, they'll go down to the moon and come back up and then leave in Orion. So from a program's perspective, Human Lander System's its own program, Orion's its own program, and then the Gateway is its own program. And so one challenge I'll say is that the Gateway program, not only is it trying to integrate all these different parts together in this orbit that I was talking about, but it's international partners. So I already mentioned ESA, JAXA is also involved, Canada is also involved. Sorry, JAXA is the Japanese Exploration Agency. So we've already got all these international partners involved. We think we're going to bring on another one in the near future. And so it's not only all these programs within NASA inside the US, but all these programs that we're trying to do internationally as well. And so this module that I just brought up is called the Esprit Refueler Module. So that's HLS going down to the moon with the crew. This Esprit Refueler Module does 2 things. One is it refuels, so it brings up fuel to transfer to the propulsion and power element so that when it needs to do orbital changes or those kind of things, it can do that. They're already doing trades on different orbits to just achieve different things. Should we get closer to the sun to do some sun physics, just different things. But it also is going to have extra space for us to look at and a big window, basically.
I love how modular it is. It can be adapted quickly for many uses.
Well, and one thing that's nice about doing
switch some parts out.
The nice thing about doing the modular is that it gives you, we built this part, we learned some things, we maybe make some modifications here before it comes up, right? So now we're turning it around. HLS is, so at this point now we're just getting rid of this HLS. We've used that module, now we don't need it anymore. We'll get a new one for the next one. Same thing with logistics. So they've dropped off their cargo. We don't need that. We'll get another cargo mission later. So here's another logistics module. So it's just showing you how it can dock to different ports because almost all of these ports provide the same services. So in this case, what they've done is they've taken the logistics module, brought it to this port, and the human lander system brought it to this port. And I think we'll see Orion come in at the other port. So these are all just kind of different options. So they're still playing with what is going to be the best scenario. So in this case, actually, Orion brought another module. So this is our final baseline module. In this case, this is the airlock. So up until this point, we have no EVA capability. We can't go outside with crew members to fix anything. And that shouldn't be a problem because the robotic arm should be able to do most of the things we need. But now Orion's brought up an airlock so that, a few years in, after we've been operating for a while, we can bring them in and we can go do things outside. You can see HLS goes down to the moon. Comes back. Orion's about to leave with the crew now. And then you're going to start to see pieces come off, right? You're going to see HLS leave, you're going to see logistics module leave because we've emptied the cargo, we've put a bunch of trash in it. That's what it'll, the crew generates a lot of trash while they're there. That'll end up in there. And it'll leave and it'll burn up in the atmosphere somewhere. And then I think, is that our final configuration? I think they'll just show maybe one more mission. There's another logistic module, so this time it came from this side. So it just shows you how we can do different things depending on the situation. Here comes the human lander system again. Orion, I think, might come in from this side, yep. And so it just shows you how we can reconfigure based on whatever the need is in that particular case. This time Orion came by itself. That may or may not be the case, right? We might find several years from now another module that we want to add to it. We're looking at things like how can we use this to be an analog for Mars, like if we were going to do a Mars mission one day. Will we attach a module here that might actually go to Mars one day, something like that. So it's being built to be very flexible to try to achieve all these different goals. We're trying to do science up there just like we do on the ISS. We're trying to be an outpost for them to go to the moon and back, right? Some place that the moon rocks come back through, right? We're going to bring the moon rocks through Gateway and back onto Orion. They're trying, like I said, we're trying to do science, we're trying to do deep space, we're trying to do, how does the environment differ when you're farther away from Earth, right? Just to what happens to the crew if they're there for 30 days versus on ISS. There'll be a lot of comparison to that. So
just in terms of like health effects or all sorts of
health effects, psychological effects, I wouldn't imagine the psychological effects would be different, but we're not always predictable, even when we think we know exactly what's going to happen, right? So, so we're learning all those things, we're learning about a different orbit. So actually we launched a mission, I think it was a joint mission with ESA again, out of New Zealand a few months ago called Capstone. Capstone's primary purpose is to go to the orbit that we're going to put Gateway in and just see how it is. How much debris is actually there. How stable is the orbit. We have all the math and all the models and all the pictures, but actually putting something there to see how it goes, just to see, hey, do we need to make any adjustments for this major program?
I am edified at that. I had no idea how it worked, and now all of a sudden I can kind of envision how it's going to work, the modular elements and just the interchangeability of it all. So, has this one been released yet?
So it came out on September 13th. So it's very new. It's out there available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I'm working on potentially some other locations as well. The paperback and the ebooks are available on both. This one's available a few more places than that, but essentially Amazon and Barnes & Noble as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Justin. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much.